And the plan, by the way, that part of the plan, not the engineering plan, but the cosmetic plan, the architectural plan, was designed by Cass Gilbert, who none other than the man who built the Woolworth building in New York, which was at one point the highest building in the world, and built the U.S. Supreme Court. U.S. Supreme Court is one of the major buildings in Washington, which is a 20th century building. You know, it doesn't look like that, but it is. And he designed the George for the towers to be completely encapsulated in concrete and then faced in granite. That's the way it was supposed to look. And they didn't have any money, they didn't do it. And so Armin was sitting there really sulking during the inauguration of the bridge, kind of unhappy about the whole thing, until people like, and I quote him here at the very beginning as the epigraph of the book, until people like Le Corbusier, probably the most influential architect of the 20th century, until Le Corbusier came along and said, the George Washington Bridge is the most beautiful bridge in the world. And Armin thought, it is, you know, because he thought of it as naked, it was just a skeleton. But you see, look at the timing. It comes along just as where we have the Deco period in architecture, and it's an incredibly Deco-looking structure. But the reason it looks like it does is because it was built that way to hold all that concrete and all that granite. You know, millions of tons of granite and rock and concrete was supposed to hang on those things. So that's why it built so strong. Other architects, Mies van der Rohe, probably if you looked at the 20th century, you'd say Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier and Frank Lloyd Wright were probably the three most influential architects. Although, and Frank had nothing to say about it, because Frank never talked about anybody else's work, only his own, or when he did talk about somebody else's work, it was just to put it down. So luckily he said nothing about the George. But Mies van der Rohe came along, called the George the most beautiful structure in the greater New York area. And he was including every single building, the most beautiful structure. So it was then that it began to become a great icon of modernism, just accidentally so. It was supposed to not only be covered with concrete, the towers, the most prominent features, not only concrete and stone, but that stone was to have all sorts of Beaux-Arts flourishes. There was supposed to be statues all over it. That it would have evoked the past. In fact, Armin himself really wanted to build a big Brooklyn Bridge. Of course, it would be different because the towers of the Brooklyn are complete masonry. This would be, in a sense, facade masonry. But that's really what he had in mind. He wanted to build a big Brooklyn Bridge. And you know, the Brooklyn, I think part of the tremendous affection that people have for the Brooklyn is its association with tragedy. The George Washington hasn't been associated with tragedy. In fact, it's been associated in some ways with great luck. An airplane actually crash landed on the upper deck of the George Washington Bridge. That was a heroic thing that long preceded, that was 62 or so, which long preceded the events of the other day where the plane nearly crashed into the George Washington Bridge on its way down. That would have been a great tragedy. It would have increased sales of my book, but forgive me for that. But the Brooklyn, I mean, John Roebling, the father, they're building the Brooklyn, and he's standing on a wharf, and a boat comes in and hits him in the foot, and he dies shortly thereafter of tetanus. Then his son, Washington Irving, who had fought in the Civil War, and they were immigrants too, Washington Irving now takes it over, and he goes down in the caissons on the Brooklyn side and gets the Benz. And is never the same again. And he supervises the construction of the Brooklyn from an apartment in Brooklyn overlooking the site, looking out the window, and sending his wife with messages to the workers as to what they're to do next. And then when the Brooklyn opens, there's a stampede. Somebody says, the Brooklyn's falling, it's going to fall, and people run and everything. And 12 people are trampled to death. So and then there was a guy jogging across it not too long ago, and a cable snapped and decapitated him one Sunday morning. So Brooklyn's whole history is a history of tragedy, really. And I'm saying that part of our affection for it, I think, is not just that it has these Gothic towers, but we have a lot of sentimental feeling about the Brooklyn that we might not have against the George or about the George, because the George is not as connected with sentiment and romantic tragedy and all of that sort of thing. But I love the George. And I want to share two things with you from the George book. There's a couple of chapters in here on the George in the arts, one on the George in literature, and the other, the George in the other arts, beginning with movies and painting, photography, and I get on to music. And I want to share a little story about, from the music part. And then I want to share with you the crazy story of how I came to climb to the top of the thing, which is in those pictures that, did they make their way around the room? Did it get over to you over here? Oh, okay, you got them back there? Okay, yeah, as long as I get them back later. So here's how it goes. And this may bring back memories for some of you. Let's see. Often when I've told people of a certain age that I was writing a book on the bridge, they broke it into a silly song, repeating the words George Washington Bridge over and over. None of them could remember where the song had originated. Sometimes they would vary the song with George Washington's Bridge, the allegation that George Washington had wooden teeth. He did have fake teeth, but they weren't made of wood. But anyway, one guy even said, oh yeah, you sing that to the Blue Danube, George Washington Bridge, George Washington, Washington Bridge. Anyway, I met so many people who would sing this silly song, which had no other words in it, over and over again. I said, well, where'd you get that song? Oh, I don't know. Well, so I felt that I had to trace the origin of it, because so many people would immediately break into the song when I would interview them about anything. They would break into the song. One of these singers pointed to a conversation between Ernie and Bert on Sesame Street that went like this. Ernie, if George Washington was going to New Jersey, why didn't he do what everybody else does? Bert, what's that, Ernie? Ernie, take the George Washington Bridge, Bert. By the way, the bridge is built at a very historic site. You know, Fort Lee was a fort. It wasn't just a bunch of high-rises. It was Fort Lee. And across the river on the other side was Fort Washington. And George Washington stood on the Palisades watching the British attacking and eventually vanquishing Fort Washington across the river, and then he knew it was time to get out of there because the British would soon, and they did, would be crossing over from Manhattan and then would be coming after his main force. Washington retreated across New Jersey, crossed into Pennsylvania, and you pretty well know the next part of the story, the famous crossing the Delaware, attacking the Hessians in Trenton. I mean, Washington knew if he didn't have some victories, some, however minor victories, everybody was going to go home. It wasn't going to work.